The ramp dropped. Metal hit wet sand. Then came the noise. Not a roar, but a tearing sound. 1,200 rounds per minute. The first man fell before his boots touched the water. The second man didn't make it to the ramp. Within 6 seconds, the landing craft was a tomb. The coxswain screamed to clear the exit, but there was no one left to move. The water turned red, then black. At 06:31 hours, the first wave of the 29th Infantry Division ceased to be a military unit. They became targets. In the command boat 10 miles offshore, the radio operator listened to the static, waiting for the code word for success. It didn't come. Would you abandon 3,000 men on a burning beach to save the 20,000 waiting behind them? This is not the story of the D-Day you know from the newsreels. This is not about the grand strategy of Operation Overlord or the liberation of Europe. This is the story of 17 specific minutes, where the entire invasion of Normandy hung by a thread. When the Supreme Allied Commander wrote a letter accepting blame for failure. When the commander of the U.S. First Army prepared the order to retreat. In the next few minutes, we are going to walk the shingle of Omaha Beach. During the window when the plan had failed, the tanks were at the bottom of the channel, and the only thing standing between the Allies and a catastrophic defeat was the refusal of broken men to die. The maps had promised them cover. The intelligence had promised them an empty beach. Reality gave them neither. The strategic plan for Omaha Beach was a masterpiece of mathematical precision. 5 miles of coastline divided into sectors: Charlie, Dog, Easy, Fox. 34,000 men were scheduled to land by 0800 hours. They were supported by 64 amphibious tanks, known as duplex drive tanks, designed to swim to shore and provide immediate heavy fire support. The timetable allowed for a margin of error of minutes. But the English Channel does not respect timetables. The wind was blowing force 4 from the northwest. The waves were chopping at 6 feet. At Omaha, the weather became an executioner. Defending those 5 miles was the veteran German 352nd Infantry Division, battle-hardened troops moved into position just days earlier, a fact Allied intelligence had missed until it was too late. The defenders were dug into the bluffs, steep, grass-covered cliffs, rising 100 to 170 feet above the high water mark. Between the sea and those cliffs lay a killing ground. At low tide, the infantry had to cross 400 yards of open sand, 400 yards without cover, 400 yards sided by 8 concrete bunkers and 35 pillboxes. The Germans called it the Devil's Garden. The Americans simply called it Dog Green, Dog White, Dog Red, and Easy Green. Sectors on a map that meant nothing to the men shivering in the flat-bottomed Higgins boats. At 0550 hours, the order was given to launch the swimming tanks. It was a suicide order. The canvas screens meant to keep the tanks afloat were designed for 1-foot swells. They were launching into 6. Of the 29 tanks launched toward the eastern half of the beach, 27 sank immediately. 3 minutes later, the crews were drowning in their steel coffins at the bottom of the channel. The infantry was going in alone. The bombardment from the air and sea was supposed to have neutralized the German defenses. It hadn't. Heavy cloud cover forced the B-24 Liberators to delay their drop by 30 seconds, to avoid hitting their own ships. That 30-second delay meant 13,000 bombs fell harmlessly into the cow pastures behind the bluffs. The German machine gunners were untouched, They were awake, and they were waiting. The first ramp hit the sand at 0630. The chaos was instantaneous. Company A of the 116th Regiment landed in front of the Vierville draw. The Germans in the strongpoint WN-71 held their fire until the ramps were down. Then they opened up. MG-42s, mortars, and 88mm artillery. Within 10 minutes, every officer and sergeant was dead or wounded. The company suffered 96% casualties. They didn't even fire a weapon. One of the 6 landing craft foundered 1,000 yards out, dragging 30 men down with it. Another took a direct hit from an artillery shell, vaporizing everyone on board. There was no cover. The tide was lower than expected, exposing 400 yards of open sand laced with obstacles. Rommel's asparagus, mined stakes, and steel hedgehogs. The men who made it out of the water dragged themselves behind the steel obstacles, shivering in the 54-degree water. Private First Class Gilbert Murdoch later recalled seeing heads simply exploding around him. Shock set in instantly. Men froze, unable to move, unable to scream. They became stationary targets for the snipers on the cliffs. The German MG-42s in the bunkers above were firing 1,200 rounds per minute. The sound was a continuous rip of canvas. At 0700 hours, the second wave landed. They didn't find a secured beachhead. They found a slaughterhouse. Boats maneuvered around floating bodies to drop their ramps, only to be hit by anti-tank shells that vaporized men before they could move. The coxswains couldn't see the obstacles. Mines strapped to wooden stakes tore the bottoms out of the boats. Engineers from the Naval Combat Demolition Units were tasked with blowing gaps in the obstacles. They had 30 minutes to clear 16 lanes. But the infantry was pinned down among the obstacles, using the steel beams for cover. The engineers couldn't blow the charges without killing their own men, so they died trying to unhook the explosives. Of the 16 teams that landed, casualties ran to 41% within the first hour. The equipment was gone. The fuses were wet. And the tide was rising. It rose at a rate of 1 foot every 8 minutes, swallowing the beach, covering the wounded, drowning the men pinned at the water's edge. Medics dragged men up the sand, only to be cut down by sniper fire from the bluffs. The 1st Infantry Division, the Big Red One, was landing on the eastern sectors. Their experience in North Africa and Sicily meant nothing here. The beach was a chaotic mix of burning vehicles, screaming men, and rising water. There was no radio contact with the destroyers offshore. The smoke from grass fires on the bluffs mixed with the gray morning mist, obscuring the targets. For the men on the beach, the war had shrunk to 3 feet of sand, and the terrifying realization that they were alone. By 0700, command and control had ceased to exist. There were no radios working. The beachmaster was dead. The company commanders were dead. The sand was a chaotic mix of units, broken and intermingled. Men from the 116th were mixed with the 16th. Rangers were mixed with engineers. No one knew where they were. They only knew they couldn't stay there. But they couldn't go forward. A seawall of shingle, smooth stones piled up by the tide, offered the only cover. Thousands of men huddled behind it, shivering, leaderless, paralyzed by the enormity of the disaster. From the bluffs, the Germans looked down on a broken army. At 0730 hours, aboard the heavy cruiser USS Augusta, Lieutenant General Omar Bradley stared at a map that no longer matched reality. He was the commander of the U.S. First Army. The reports coming in were fragmented. terrified and hopeless. Entire first wave foundered, no troops inland, beach clogged with wreckage. Bradley stood on the bridge, the smell of cordite drifting 5 miles out to sea. He had a decision to make. Behind the initial assault waves, 25,000 more men were circling in landing craft, waiting for the signal to go in. If he sent them in, he might just be adding bodies to the pile. If he pulled them back, he would leave the survivors on the beach to be captured or killed, and the invasion of Europe would fail on its first morning. He began to draft the order to divert the follow-up waves to Utah Beach, or the British sector at Gold. He was 17 minutes away from calling the retreat. At 0745, he turned to his staff. "It's a nightmare," he said. The might of the American military had been stopped by a few hundred feet of sand. But the Germans had made one miscalculation. They assumed the men on the beach were a cohesive unit, waiting for orders. They weren't. They were survivors. And survivors do not wait for orders. They move or they die. On the beach, the stalemate was breaking, not by command, but by instinct. At 0740, Brigadier General Norman Dutch Cota, the assistant commander of the 29th Division, walked upright across the sand of the dog-white sector. He ignored the sand kicking up around his boots. He found a group of Rangers huddled behind the seawall. His words were not recorded by a stenographer, but they were burned into the memory of every man who heard them. "Gentlemen, we are being killed on the beaches. Let us go inland and be killed." It wasn't strategy. It was desperation. But it wasn't just generals. It was lieutenants, sergeants, and privates who realized that staying on the beach meant death. Colonel George Taylor of the 16th Infantry Regiment arrived moments later and yelled the words that would cut through the noise of battle. "Two kinds of people are staying on this beach: the dead and those who are going to die. Now let's get the hell out of here." Small groups of men began to move, not as a wave, but as individuals. A sergeant here, a private there. They used Bangalore torpedoes, long pipes filled with explosives, to blow gaps in the barbed wire. They didn't charge the bunkers. They crawled, inch by bloody inch, up the draws, through the smoke of the burning grass. The grass fires, started by naval shelling, were an accident, but the smoke blinded the German gunners just enough. At 0800 hours, a single platoon from the 116th crested the bluff near Vierville. They had no radio to report it. They just started killing the gunners, who had been slaughtering their friends. The deadlock was broken, not by generals, not by tanks, by wet, terrified men who simply refused to die on the sand. But out at sea, something shifted. The realization hit the captains of the destroyers before it hit the generals. They could see the slaughter through their binoculars. The order was, "Hold fire if unsure." They ignored it. The USS Frankfurt, USS McCook, and USS Carmack turned their bows toward the shore. They sailed until their keels were scraping the sand, risking grounding, risking annihilation from the shore batteries. At 0800 hours, from just 800 yards out, they unleashed hell. 5-inch guns fired point-blank into the German bunkers. They were so close, the blast waves shook the men on the beach. A pillbox that had been pinning down the 1st Division for 2 hours disintegrated in a cloud of concrete and dust. The German defenders, who thought the battle was won, suddenly found themselves under direct naval artillery fire. It wasn't in the plan. It was a decision made by men who saw other men in trouble. The suppression fire lifted the heads of the infantry. The wire was cut. The bluffs were breached. General Bradley, watching through his binoculars, saw the smoke clearing. He put the order to retreat back in his pocket. The cost of those first few hours was catastrophic. The final casualty count for Omaha Beach remains an estimate to this day. Conservatively, 2,400 killed, wounded, or missing in the first few hours. Some estimates run as high as 4,700. The 116th Infantry Regiment alone lost 1,007 men. The 29th Division, a National Guard unit from Virginia, lost men who had grown up on the same streets, played on the same baseball teams. In a town called Bedford, 19 boys died in those first 17 minutes. 19 families received telegrams on the same day. The sand was littered with the debris of an army that had almost been pushed back into the sea. The tide continued to rise, pushing the wreckage and the bodies against the seawall. The water was thick with crimson foam. It remained red for 3 days. 2,400 men. Most of their names have faded. The men who knew them are almost gone. What survives is what gets passed on. The breakout from Omaha was ugly, confused, and slow, but it happened. By noon, the German 352nd Division was running low on ammunition. They had fired over 40,000 rounds from a single bunker. They had expected the Americans to retreat. They hadn't accounted for the sheer stubbornness of the men on the shingle. The beach was secured by 1,300 hours. The German commander, General Kreis, finally ordered a retreat. He reported to Berlin that the beach had been contained. He was wrong. The Atlantic Wall had been breached. Strategically, Omaha was the linchpin. Without it, the British at Gold Beach and the Americans at Utah Beach would have been separated by 20 miles of enemy territory. The Germans could have driven a wedge between the beachheads and rolled them up one by one. The decision Bradley almost made to abandon the beach would have likely collapsed the entire Western Front before it opened. The logistics of the war depended on this stretch of sand. The mulberries, the fuel lines, the millions of tons of supplies, all of it had to pass over the ground where these men died. It was a victory of logistics, yes, but first it was a victory of sheer, bloody stubbornness. By nightfall, 34,000 troops had landed. The toehold was less than 1.5 miles deep, but it was enough. The German High Command was slow to react. They believed the invasion at Normandy was a feint. They held back their panzer divisions, waiting for the real attack at Calais. By the time they realized the truth, the toehold at Omaha was ironclad. But there is a detail often missed in the analysis of fire and movement. The men who breached the Atlantic Wall that morning were not elite commandos. They were terrified conscripts, seasick, half-drowned, and leaderless. The officers were dead. The radios were broken. The plan was gone. The victory didn't come from the general on the cruiser. It came from the private who decided, entirely on his own, to stand up and run toward the machine guns. History focuses on the generals. Omaha belongs to the privates. This is the kind of story that disappears if no one tells it. The textbooks don't have room for 17 minutes. The documentaries don't have time for the men who crawled. We do. If you've made it this far, you already know if you belong here. The sun went down over the French coast at 2200 hours. The fires were still burning. Medics were still working. The timeline of the invasion had been restored. bought with minutes of unimaginable courage. The beach was taken, but the men who took it, they were not the same men who landed. Some of you watching know a name, a grandfather who never talked about it, an uncle whose medals sat in a drawer, a face in a photograph no one can identify anymore. If they were there, at Omaha, Utah, gold, Juno, sword, this is their archive too. The sand at Omaha is clean today. The bunkers are empty. But the silence there is heavy. It demands we listen. The beach was secured, but the hedgerows were waiting. That story is next.